And that is the magic of the Trialogue team, ladies and gentlemen. I did say to Kathy, I might just be applying for a job as well. So, on to our first conversation, a dialogue with Trialogue. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome these three participants on stage. And once I have them on stage, we're going to talk a little bit about the state of CSI, because this is where we're really wanting to go. And preceding that conversation, we're going to talk about the Strategic CSI Award. Let me welcome onto the stage Nick Rockey, Managing Director of Trialogue. Let's give Nick a big round of applause. Beryl Traore, I hope I've got that right. Beryl is the Social Impact Lead at Sappi. Let's give her a round of applause. And Mr. Bhekinkosi Moyo, who's a director at CAPSI, which of course is the Center on African Philanthropy and Social Investments. Let's give him a round of applause. Yes, you can sit right here. Thank you very much. So, just to put into context the different individuals that I have on stage here today, I want to bring to our attention that we know of the Trialogue Strategic CSI Award, started in 2014, Nick, if I'm not mistaken. And the essence of the award is really to try and celebrate best practice in strategic CSI in the sector. And when we're talking about best practice, and Nick is going to give us a little bit more content about what does that actually look like, but we are looking for practices that benefit both the business as well as society. And this is where the strategic element of it comes through. Bhekinkosi, who's with us here today, was one of the independent judges that participated in the judging last year together with Gugu, McLaren, I think Ushe Wenkunza, who's not with here today, but Gugu's from NBI, and together they allowed us to go through the criteria to land at the winner for 2023. And the winner, of course, for 2023 was Sappi's Kulisa program. And of course, that gives us context as to why Beryl is sitting here today. And I think it's important because it allows us to pull through that moment from last year being 2023, but to bring it back into relevance today, and to use this conversation to remind everyone that the applications for the Strategic CSI Award are now open. They're on the Trialogue website, and you can go to the website to begin to go through that process. But Nick, let me then start off with you. And the question is, what is strategic about the Strategic CSI Award? What makes it strategic? And would you say, more importantly, that the awards have elevated the conversation around CSI in the country?
No, thank you. And I think it's in the definition, it's in the name. Strategic means it's strategic to the business. And in that, there needs to be some sort of business payback. And it's a little bit, it can be a little bit confusing to people who look at it from the outside. You know, you're looking for a business benefit, but this is primarily a developmental intervention.
Yes.
And companies are good and they understand the developmental side. But when you ask them to quantify how the business benefits can accrue, it's often a little more tricky for them. They're not used to thinking about it in those terms. And the reason it's strategic is that you can leverage, if it's aligned to the programs are aligned to the business, they can leverage business resources, and they can draw on those and ultimately achieve more developmentally through, and also achieve more from a business perspective. And there are a number of elements. You know, I think Mary Metcalf spoke about vanity projects.
Yeah.
Strategic takes you out of that space completely, and says you've got to be in a project, you've got to look at the developmental outcomes over a period of time, so you've got to be more focused. You've got to put M&E processes in place to understand the developmental impact. So you're strategic on a developmental front, and then you've got to think how the business can leverage that, but also the benefits that flow back to the business. And that, in the essence, is what it's about. The question around have the awards process helped? Yeah. Everyone likes to win. So the attention that comes with that, I think. And we've been running this for some time.
Yeah.
But the process of applying, I think, really takes companies into a space where they have to think about it.
Yeah.
They've got to think through the application, and I think there's some aha moments that come out of that process. And it does elevate the conversation. You know, we've had these conversations. It's been in the book for a long time. We have this language coming back at us, which is lovely to see, matrices that we've developed. People are building into their strategies.
Yeah.
So I think it has elevated the conversation. It's elevated the thinking.
Yeah, Nick, thank you very much. And you remind me of the comment that Bonang made yesterday, and that his doing good makes sure that the business does well. And so it's both, and it's not either or. And again, of course, Professor Metcalf was the one who reminded us about the danger of the vanity projects. And this is, as you say, one of the pathways to make sure that you avoid those dangers. Let me then jump to Bhekinkosi with the next question. Bhekinkosi, take us to last year. As you were looking at Sappi's application, what is it about the Khulisa program that made it stand out as a strategic program and one that was worthy of this particular award?
Yeah, thank you so much, and thanks to Trialogue for inviting me once again. Over the last 3 years, I've had the benefit and the pleasure of reading through the entries to judge the awards. And so, you know, there's a criteria that we use, and I want to locate the Sappi award within that criteria. So the first, as Nick said, for the award to be strategic, it's got to at least meet the two requirements. On the one end, it's got to have social benefits.
Yeah.
On the other, it's got to have corporate benefits. So what we do look at is, firstly, the objectives. Are they SMART? By SMART, I think everyone here understands what that refers to. And we found that the Sappi Khulisa program was objectives that were targeted, SMART, measurable, among others. And so it was very clear to really pick it out of the rest of the entries that were there. Of course, there were others that that also had very good objectives. But the second element is we look at the social benefits.
Right.
So the first is we look at what we call the visible outputs. And by visible outputs, we are looking at, you know, for example, the number of people that they trained in terms of growing timber and forestry and all of that. And so they were very clear in terms of the numbers that they trained, and that I'm sure they are going to tell you about the numbers that go, you know, individuals is over 7,000, people that they trained, SMEs, they trained more than 4,200, if I remember very well. Etc. And they'd spent a particular amount of money that they targeted to spend about 133 million. They ended up spending more than that, 245 million. So we could really, you know, pull out some of those visible outputs.
Yeah.
But we also looked at beneficial outcomes. In other words, what are the changes in behavior?
Yeah.
And we begin to see that most of the farmers now had access to the market. They were being trained and they're now benefiting in terms of skills in collaboration with some of the institutes that they were working with. We also look at beneficial impact. In this case, we're looking at the long-term outcomes that the project is likely to have over a long period of time. And for them, I think, you know, if you have read their case, they've been around for the past 40 years. And what we found exciting about it is that, you know, there was continuity between their interventions and the relationship with the community. But on the side of the corporate benefits, we look at three things as well. The first is corporate reputation. In other words, does this project bring reputation to the corporate and the business? And in their case, we realized that they had actually even improved their BBEE scorecard. They were beginning to also, work in close proximity with other companies and other institutions. We also look at corporate, stakeholder benefits. In other words, are the stakeholders that are engaged benefiting in the relationship, and they seemed to meet that criteria. And finally, we actually looked at corporate reputation, like I said. And so I think those were some of the things that we looked at. And among all the groups that we judged, they ticked most of those boxes. And I'm sure you will get the details from
Beryl. I'm certain, and I'm going to Beryl in a second, but I think one of the things that you've said that I think is just so powerful is that they are both visible and I'll say in inverted commas, invisible things that we need to measure. It's the qualitative and the quantitative. It's not just about counting the number of people who have trained. It's also about understanding the outcomes and the long-term impact that's come through. And I think that's really exciting to see that we have candidates that meet those criteria comfortably. So maybe, Beryl, let's get to the nuts and bolts of the COLISA program in essence. How does the program work? How does the program run? And how is it aligned to core business? Because I would imagine that's part of the reason why you see the benefits to business, even as it is a CSI function.
Thank you very much. So as Bheki said, the project has been around for over 40 years. Started in 1983. It was called Project Grow at the time. We started with 3 growers, and how the project works is the communities or growers provide land where we can plant our eucalyptus trees. We provide them with the seedlings, the technical support, training, loans, as well as the technicals and the training support, and also a guaranteed access to market. And so we started with 3 growers, and now we're on 4,200 growers, 200 SMMEs that directly service those growers with silviculture, transportation, and so forth. So we looked at the project and how we can make use of this project in the entire forestry value chain. We're sitting on now also empowering women, where we have 80% of our growers being women.
Sure.
We've got stories about young people who have gone through university because their parents or grandparents were growers. So that qualitative and quantitative data, I can talk about how much annually they're turning over 200,000 tons of timber from our community growers. From those SMMEs alone, not talking about the grower businesses,
Sure.
There's been employment of over 1,700 people in those communities. Things like that. And I mean, it really just started at looking at a problem. We needed a quality timber, steady supply of it. Our neighbors had land. They were not making any money from the land, and they needed jobs. So how did we bring those things together? And that's where the strategic CSI came together to say, how do we create shared value from what your needs are and what our needs are, and making sure that you are sustainable so we remain sustainable.
Yeah.
And while we're sustainable, you continue to be sustainable. So that's really the premise of the program.
And I know I know that the program, Becky tells us, has been running for 40 years. But what is the experience of being like to keep business engaged and convinced about the significance and the importance of this? Because it sounds like there's benefits on both sides, but I would also imagine that you've got to keep the conversation alive to ensure that it stays and continues to be seen as a strategic opportunity for business as well.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the challenges we learned early on, to say that as we bring communities involved in the program, understanding asset-based community development, internally, our staff has to know that this project is not just a project on the side, but it's part of our DNA. If this project doesn't work, we lose out on 10% of our timber. So those constant communications internally around sustainability of our communities and building that trust within the community so that we can thrive in that community and so that the community can thrive as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting, that sustained conversation, communication internally and externally. Nick, let me swing my way back to you. One of the first poll we did this morning was really to try and get a sense from our audience, what do they think the trends that are driving CSI are? And I kind of want to put that question to you now to say, what is shaping and influencing CSI 3.0, if I can put it like that? And in particular, what do you think companies should be aiming for, and what should they be aligning with themselves with in order to realize a leveraged CSI?
Yeah, I think 3.0 is a terminology that we've adopted, and it's really strategic CSI on steroids, if you like. It's how do you have an impact beyond just the confines of the project? How do you really make it core to the business, and how do you affect a broader space? So if you like, CSI has evolved from, giving practices,
Yeah.
charitable CSI, to more strategic. And I think when one looks at the scale of investment, we had it last year at 11.8 billion rand. It's relatively small compared to what government's spending. It's less than 1% of what government's spending in equivalent spaces. And if you take individual programs, it's minuscule. So how do you take those small amounts of funding, relatively small, and have a big impact? And that's the conversation around leverage CSI. And we've heard it through the conference, Mary Metcalf talking about, how you can influence, how you can spend money on research and shared learning, so that others can come around. Dr. Pumlamni Kontwana was speaking about the data and how that can be a central point where people can develop common metrics. And that's what we're talking about in terms of leverage CSI, where you've got common reference points and people within a space coming around collaborating to achieve a broader impact. It's not for everyone. I need to say that. It's complicated. It takes time. There's nothing wrong with CSI 1.0 for, depending on the size of the budget and your own context, or strategic CSI as we name it. And it's a continuum. It's not one box versus the next box versus the other box. But if you have big budgets and you want to influence a bigger space, then you need to think how to leverage that, investing in research, investing in collaborative processes, and the like. And that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, that's really interesting to help us understand the evolution from 1.0 to 3.0, but also what does it really mean to get to leverage CSI? And some of those threads came through, Nick. I just want to bring a question to you, Nick, that's just come from Joseph in our audience, because I think it speaks to the opportunity that you're highlighting for us. And Joseph is saying, how do we ensure that corporates align their CSI strategies to global goals, like the Sustainable Development Goals? So it's not just what we like, or what we find sexy as a corporate right now, but what the world needs, and what everybody is trying to achieve for the world at this moment.
Yeah, I mean, you can come at it from an SDG perspective and say, which goals should we choose? Or you can come at it from a corporate perspective and say, where can we have the greatest impact? And I'll pretty much guarantee you that no matter what you do developmentally, you will align to one of those SDG goals. So to us, it's about having the most developmental impact.
Yeah.
And linking it back you can link it back to the goals. You can have a conscious process to say, how do we advance those goals? But ultimately, I think you need to bring it back to where you can influence the greatest. Using your geographic footprint, using your technology. If you're a Vodacom, as we heard, using your reach into millions, 50 plus million cell phone subscribers. How do you use that to actually have a developmental impact?
So on the note of geography, I want to maybe build on that, Bheki, and invite us to go beyond South Africa and consider the broader geography of Africa. How does South Africa compare in terms of its CSI trends with the rest of the continent? And maybe the second part of that question is, are there lessons for us to learn, especially as corporates in South Africa, that we could learn from how CSI is being experienced and being undertaken on the continent?
Yeah, thank you. And I want to start by really acknowledging the role that the Business and Society Handbook plays, because it actually outlines most of the major trends in the CSI space. And in fact, those trends are what we are currently discussing, trends around collaborations, and I think you see that also across the continent. But research actually and studies show that South Africa is actually leading in terms of the practice of CSI, both in terms of the expenditures. I think from the handbook you saw that last year, corporates spent close to 12 billion rands to different causes, but also in terms of engagement, especially around some of the key developmental issues. I don't think South Africa fares very well ahead of other countries, especially when you track the engagement, especially with SDGs. And I'm sure that you saw that from last year's report. It shows that corporates here in South Africa are engaging more with SDGs than with the NDP, which is a fascinating trend to actually watch this year going forward. But also, I think in terms of research, we're also beginning to see For our case at CAPSI, we're beginning to see more and more students who are coming from the corporate world, from Africa,
Yes.
wanting to study the trends in corporate social responsibility. So I think South Africa has a lot to actually teach and share lessons with some of the African countries, because they are still way behind in terms of the practice, but also the knowledge availability and access. But I think there are also some global trends which I think I might want to just speak
Yeah.
about, which might be useful to think about. The first is really around the question of sustainability.
Yeah.
And the question of sustainability is really about, the bigger debates right now that we are having around, the energy just transition,
Yes.
climate change, green economies, and how us as consumers we would want to align with that agenda. And I think that's one trend for us to really look at. And it's a 2024 global trend that companies are beginning to want to focus on. The second is really around issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah.
Both in terms of procurement, in terms of recruitment, in terms of the services that we provide. I think that's a big question that we have seen, not just in the corporate sector, but also broadly in the philanthropic space. And I think that's a trend that I would want us to pay attention to. The third is actually I think it came up in one of your polls, which is, the adoption of artificial intelligence, both in companies supporting that, but also companies using AI in terms of executing their corporate social investments or responsibility. We saw from last year's report that there was a slow uptake, but my suspicion is that going forward, we're going to see a huge progress in terms of companies adopting AI and utilizing it. And then finally, of course, like I said, for us, I think is to also track some of the trends. And I think one of the developments today is that the president is going to be signing the bill,
Yes.
the NHI bill.
Yes.
And I think it would be good for companies and for us to track, what that means in terms of the implications for corporate social investment. There's still a big question around how this is going to be fully funded and sustainable. So I think those are some of the trends that I wanted to also refer to, which are global trends, which have got huge implications for us here in the continent.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, especially as you talk about, what's very much alive in the South African policy space right now, the NHI, because what I'm hearing you say is that an awareness and a consciousness of the policy environment is also important to understand what it is and where a country is going. I think it's also interesting that you've said the SDGs seem to be a focal point more than the NDP for many corporates. And I think that's probably worth exploring in other ways. I've got a couple of questions that have come through, and I want to get to Beryl, but I just wanted to see if I can paraphrase Kagisho's paragraph and try and be brief about it. And I want to bring it to you, Becky. Kagisho is saying, often it's left to the CSI and the philanthropy functions to take care of a company's socio-economic responsibilities beyond the core. In light of that, what additional measures can we weave into KPIs beyond the core functions to really harness the awareness of this additional responsibility? And then I'm going to leave it there because I think Kagisho's built in 7 questions, so we're going to just do that one question. And I'm going to paraphrase it again and just say, Kagisho's saying, how do we make sure that we actually bring KPIs around CSI into the center for strategic roles within an organization? So it's not only sitting with the CSI manager or the head of the foundation, but it's actually visible for all of the executives in an organization.
Yeah, I think, some of the companies would actually have a specific foundation or unit that deals with that. But I think the reporting lines usually speak volumes to the importance of how that company prioritizes CSI. But secondly, I actually think we also need to get out of the company space and talk about the social license to operate.
Yes.
Because I think more often you can have all of these things embedded in the company, but if the communities that are involved are not playing an active role, we find that at times it's very difficult to have that alignment between communities and the objectives of the CSI. So I would probably say, in addition to the KPIs and the internal controls and mechanisms, let's also pay attention to the social license to operate. What is the role of the different community members and associations in holding companies to account, especially in areas where they operate?
And of course, what I'm hearing you say, Beg, is that the social license to operate sits more beyond the KPI of the CSI manager. It actually should be sitting across the business. Beryl, I want to bring Mpho's question to you. Mpho is saying 40 years is a very long time, and she says, well done for that. But what innovative improvements have you done to make sure that the program remains relevant within the context of the business and the context of the community, so that it really is sustained over time?
Constantly evaluating where you're at, where the community's at, what the needs are, collecting data, analyzing the data, and trusting what the data is telling you. And I think I like what Prof has just said about using AI and using technology, and that has been a big focus for us as we move into the next phase of this project. How do we make sure that our growers the majority of our growers are young people? How are they bringing in innovation into the space? As you can imagine, forestry is almost like an old industry. And there's definitely opportunities to look at something and think, I'm sure we can do this better by using technology and so forth. So that's what our focus is at the moment, to try and bring that closer to where the rest of the world is in terms of industry. Because Sappi is very unique that we've got the manufacturing in our mills, and their innovation has to be constant in our products, in how we do our business. And then we've got forestry that's kind of slow. I mean, it takes 8 to 10 years for you to be able to cut down that tree for us to be able to use it. So all of those, in between those 10 years also, what are we doing with those growers? How are we exposing them to other sources of income as well?
Final question for the panel before we just look at the poll together. German, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, German Moore, says, Beryl, you mentioned that Sappi provides loans for the community growers. You also mentioned that you give training as well. But the question is, do you give them training on how to use the funds so that they can actually pay you back?
Oh, yes. So the training is about technically what they need to do.
Can we just get the mic back, please, again? Go for it.
Okay. So the training is about, we have Ulwazi, we call them Ulwazi skill centers, where there's a whole series that you have to do. So it's about being an entrepreneur, because they now are entrepreneurs. What are those business skills that are needed when you are provided with the loan to start up? How do you use it? And all of that kind of training that goes in with it. So it's about the technical, being that grower or the farmer, but then also now being the business person and all the things, the fundamentals you need to be able to be successful in that.
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant question to really get into a little bit of the detail around what does that training entail, because for the business, it would be important to also see the returns coming through on those loans. So let's maybe go back to the poll and let's see how our audience has responded. Nick, I'm keen to hear what you think about the response to these polls. I'm not sure if your eyes can see enough, but I'm going to talk you through it. The question is, which trend do you think is most likely to improve the effectiveness of CSI? At 38%, so almost 40% in the room say, actually, and online, of course, is we actually need more collaboration between companies. 16% is saying we need greater alignment with company strategy, and another 16% saying we need to improve our giving practices. As you think through this, through the lens of CSI 3.0, what do you think about those numbers?
I think collaboration's been spoken about a lot, and collaboration between companies is always tricky. Companies like to, sort of preserve their brand and their brand recognition. So reaching out, I think it's an important, and it's nice that it's been recognized. But I think it goes beyond just collaboration between companies. It comes, we're talking about collaboration between all role players. Again, Mary Metcalf said, you've got to have government in the room. You've got to have an exit strategy where those who own the project can continue with the project. That requires a lot of other different types of parties around the table. And it's really, it's not one of those. It's kind of all of them. Knowledge sharing is critical. Improved giving and efficient giving practices. All of these things are important. We picked one, and I think it's a great one. It's in line with our
Yeah.
our conference theme. But I think it's about combining all of these different factors in a way that really makes sense from a strategic perspective.
So it is about combining all of them. So as I wrap up the panel, I'm going to do something different because it's day 2. You got to switch it up a notch a little bit, put people on the spot. So Nick, this is what we're going to do. Beryl, Bheki as well. I'm going to ask you to come up with a billboard, right? It's a billboard. It's not an executive summary. It is not a speech. It's not a presentation. It's a billboard. And the billboard starts with the following line: the future of CSI. You get to complete the sentence. We're going to put that billboard right outside here so that anybody coming to focus rooms next year knows what the future of CSI is. So what tends to happen, and these guys are so brave, what tends to happen is that panelists look away and avoid my eyes at this point, but they're all looking at me dead on, which is usually a sign that you're confident and you know what your billboard's going to be. Nick, you're giving me a very confident look, so I'm going to start off with you. The future of CSI?
The future of CSI is better than change. No, that's awful. Striker.
Okay, we strike that one. We start again. And of course, if you're online on the chat, please let me know what you think the future of CSI is. You'll choose the best billboard. Nick, let's go again. The future of CSI
is lasting impact.
Ladies and gentlemen, the future of CSI is lasting impact. Let's give Nick a round of applause. I'm going to just make my way down the row, just to be fair. Beryl, the future of CSI?
Is creating shared value.
Is creating shared value. Let's give Beryl a round of applause. And Bheki, you get to take us home. The future of CSI.
So I would say the future of CSI is people-centered, technologically driven, and globally sustainable.
It still fits in the billboard. People-centered, technologically driven, and globally
sustainable.
Globally sustainable. I think let's give our panelists a big round of applause. Thank you very much. So if you're going to be a panelist today, you know that there's going to be some tricky on-the-spot maneuvers. Thank you so much. Let's give them a big round of applause. Thank you so very much.